Once upon a time, I was a moe guy. I know a lot of people perceive me as one of those anyways, but hear me out. Once upon a time, I was mainly a moe guy. It's kind of an odd transition, maybe something of an overcompensation between my tween and late teen years. Because when I was a kid, all growing up, I was deathly, I'll say, afraid of anything to do with girls. I wanted nothing to do with girls at all. Anything girly, anything emasculine, I just stayed away from. I wanted stuff to be manly or boyish or just to remind me of myself. I didn't like girl characters in the shows I did watch, and I certainly wouldn't watch a show that was about girls. I don't know what made me like that. I don't know if it was just sheer stubbornness, because I'm sure that played a huge role in it. For me growing up, I would form an opinion of something, and I would stick to it ardently. No matter what, it had to be consistent because I wanted to have an identity. Things that I felt strongly associated with, I had to keep up appearances of being into those things, even if I mentally was well aware that the tide had changed. So when I was like 12 and I was getting really big into anime, I still kept up this illusion, this idea that I hated girls and wanted nothing to do with girls, even though I was quickly becoming attracted to girls and was, looking at all these hot girls in the shows I watched, like Kagome from Inuyasha, or the girls in like Samurai Deeper Kyo, and whatever shows I was watching. Oh, King of Bandits Jing has a lot of cute girls in it. So I was getting into girls, but I wouldn't admit this. Meanwhile, my older cousin Boyd, who was the one who got into anime with me, who was 16, he was way into girls, and he was always talking about how that's one of his favorite things in the world is girls, and I was like, I don't care about girls. So of course, obviously, as I go through my mid-teens, I quickly realize I care a lot about girls. Girls are great. And in fact, I almost swing the pendulum entirely in the other direction, and somehow I come to a point where I only care about girls. Somewhere around this period that I discovered the Mega Tokyo forums, got into watching current anime. I talked about this in some of the previous podcasts that I'd watched Haruhi as my first fan sub, which is a show with a lot of girls. Main character's a guy, but the girls were the ones who I was really paying attention to. Then I get into Manabi Straight and Hidamari Sketch, which are shows about almost exclusively girls. And I was like totally afraid of anyone seeing me watching this because I have two little brothers, one who's a year and a half younger than me and one who is 6 years younger than me, and the idea of them like finding out that I was watching these girly shows was terrifying. Even though I knew these shows like weren't meant for girls, I nonetheless had this feeling like I can't be caught dead watching a girly show, and I persisted that way for like 6 months. I would sneak around when I watched shows. I would wake up early in the morning because I went to school at like 6 a.m., 6:30, something like that, so I'd wake up at like 4 a.m. and watch as much anime as I could until it was time to go to school. Then when I got home from school, I would go into my brother Victor's room because I didn't have my own computer that could connect to the internet. I had one that just didn't function. And my brother had just gotten a new computer that could. So because he was in middle school and I was in high school, he got home an hour and a half after me. So I'd go into his room and watch 3 episodes of anime before he got home, but I wouldn't watch any while he was there, even though I would sometimes hang out in his room all day, but I wouldn't watch anime in there because I didn't want him to see me watching girly shows. Not that he would have given a single fuck. In fact, had I not been so obstinate, it probably would have helped him because he would have felt like he could admit to liking girly stuff as well. Because me and him at this phase, he especially went through a like obsession with manliness. Later in 2007, we'd watch Gurren Lagann and like we used the word manly as a substitute for the word cool. Like you would describe something, 300 came out around this time, a hyper masculine movie, so we'd be like, oh, manly, this is so manly. And that was also an era when Maddox's Alphabet of Manliness and his website were out and Chuck Norris jokes. Like hyper masculinity was a kind of a meme and a cultural thing of the time, and we were really into it. Even though in my off time, all I care about is watching cute girl shows. So it was really through Manabi Straight and Hidamari Sketch that I got into that genre, mostly through Hidamari Sketch. And in the subsequent season, there was Lucky Star, which I at first didn't really like. In fact, I dropped Lucky Star at episode 14, watched it later that year with my friend all the way through, and still didn't really care for it. And it wasn't until the next year that I got really into that show. But we had like Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei, and then I got really obsessed with Shinbo, and I just gradually got more and more into girl shows, and then I got into Yuri later that year and had that whole thing that I talked about on the last episode. So like just generally 2007 was a year of me becoming more and more and more obsessed with cute girls. Now, the funny thing about it is that I still had a knee-jerk reaction to like overly girly stuff. Because again, these shows are not really made for girls. They're shows about girls, but they're all sort of otaku oriented. Oh, I remember I watched Revolutionary Girl Utena, and I was trying to hide that one from my brother, because finally at some point his computer ended up in my room and would just stay there for the rest of time. So I started being able to watch anime during the day, just out in the open. And I watched like Simone and Utena, and I remember my brother like walking in while I was watching it, and I like paused it and was like all ashamed and stuff. He didn't give a fuck. Nobody cared. Eventually, this Band-Aid got ripped off. Around the time that I decided I wanted my walls to be covered in anime girl posters, that's when suddenly it was apparent to everybody that I was way into cute anime girls. Yeah, this was like a weird evolution thing, but I still couldn't handle, like, I remember one time watching the first episode of Princess Tutu and just being like, this is too girly for me. And it took a while for me to, like, warm up to magical girl shows and stuff. And I remember it was somewhere between watching like the first couple episodes of Futago Hime, which is a pretty obscure magical girl show, and like Kiruminzu, like a few of these super cutesy ones that I was watching more because they were about like cute lollies than out of like wanting to watch a shoujo magical girl thing. Precure, Heartcatch Precure, that was a big one. Like between those shows, I started to warm up to magical girls, and that's how I got more into shoujo. And then eventually I would watch Cardcaptor Sakura and get really into that, and then eventually got to a point where I could just watch shows that were for little girls and enjoy it as much as anything else. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. In this period of 2007 through 2008, I kind of became a moe guy, and part of it was out of contrarianism. People often accuse me of being contrarian today, and I don't think I really set out to do anything to be contrary. I just happen to have different tastes from most people. Like, I've said this plenty of times, I would love nothing more than for my favorite anime to also be the most popular anime that's out at a time, because then it would be really easy for me to talk about it and everyone would care. You know, like, it would be much better for my career if my favorite anime of the year had been, like, let's say Mob Psycho, and I, like, had a ton to say about it, which I managed to get a Mob Psycho video out. It got a shitload of views. That was a really good bonus. Like, I'm glad I liked that show. But, like, what if I had loved ReZero and had a lot to say about that, which some people did. Some people wrote analytically about that show. There was stuff to say about it. I just hated it. So it's not a good career move to be contrary all the time. People seem to think it is for some reason, and it's really not. Like, you'll do much better if you sort of agree with public consensus, because people want to hear things that they already agree with. So yeah, but in my past, I definitely was more of a contrarian. And it's not so much that I would specifically go out of my way to enjoy or dislike shows based on what was popular, but if I liked something that wasn't popular, I became a very, very strident hero for the cause, you know? Like, growing up as a kid, I was a huge Nintendo fanboy. All I cared about was Nintendo. I had all their consoles. I didn't like any of the other ones, and it wasn't so much that I knew the first thing about Sony or Microsoft games, but other people would criticize Nintendo and say like, oh, Nintendo's for kids, Nintendo, I don't want a GameCube, PS2's better, Grand Theft Auto. And so I became like this vicious Nintendo defender. Like, all I cared about was like, oh, well, people don't like Nintendo? Well, I'm gonna like it more than anybody. Oh, I'm gonna be the ultimate, blah, blah, you know? And like, I think that mindset is how I became about moe, because in the late 2000s, if you liked moe, there were a lot of people who hated you just for that fact. I mean, there still are. There are still people who will criticize my videos and say, oh, you like too much moe shit. What's all this? If you go read the comments on my top 20 or top 10 anime of the year lists, see a bunch of people crying about moe. That anime snob is always bitching about me liking moe. But back then, there wasn't also a huge amount of people who loved it. Like, right now, I can make a video about a moe show, and there's gonna be some people who are like totally on my side. I've converted a ton of K-On! Fans, but back then, liking a moe show just meant that you were the cancer-killing anime. Because whereas nowadays, something like, say, the mecha genre is just dead, back then, it was dying, and people who loved it were blaming moe because moe is this emergent trend that is getting popular in its own right. I don't really think moe, killed mecha or anything. That whole train of thought is just totally misguided, but that's what people perceived it as, is that moe is taking away our manly anime. Which it's not too surprising that people felt that way, because the reason a lot of people got into anime was out of hyper-masculine shows. A lot of stuff in the 90s, when you look at something like Ninja Scroll, which is about badass samurai cutting people up, and a lot of the shows back then were hyper-violent and hyper-sexual, and that's why people got into anime. They saw it more as a genre thing. And I think that the reason all this infighting started happening in the late 2000s is that people were becoming more aware of stuff outside their genre. Where, the stuff that was coming to America in the 90s was all the hyper-violent action OVAs, but it's not like that's all the anime that was actually being made in Japan. There were tons and tons of harem comedies and bullshit that, there was a fan base for those in the US, but they were kind of overshadowed. And I think that when we got into the internet age and suddenly all this moe stuff was easily accessible and there were people on blogs talking about it, then it suddenly looked like this opposition to what the manly men anime fans had been hoping to talk about. So yeah, there was a lot of argument and consternation between these two factions on the internet. And so the thing is that most people who were into moe were kind of minding their own business about it, whereas people who were into the manly action shows and stuff were very vocally anti-moe. So I was like, I'm gonna be the fucking opposition force. If these guys are gonna keep attacking the shit I like, I'm going to become a defender of it and say, no, fuck you, I don't like the stuff you like. Now, this manifested in me being anti-plot, which... Look, these days, I love me a good story. Back then, the way I saw it was that every story has been told before, as the old saying goes. Everything is just a rewrite of an old tale. So there's no story that's particularly original or interesting. It's all just new takes on the same thing. And I saw story as just kind of a boring element of a series. I really cared about characters. I wanted to see characters who I just would watch because I like them, and it didn't matter what they were doing. And Hidamari Sketch for me was the ultimate example of this. And I had written this post about characterization at the time called Great Characters, Depth, Development, and Chemistry. These are the three elements that I thought you needed for great characterization, because people would always talk about characters being deep or developed. A deep character is one who has a lot of backstory, who has reasons for acting the way that they do, that you understand different aspects of their psyche. They're not one note. They don't just have one personality trait. They're multifaceted. They go through different moods. The characters in Neon Genesis Evangelion are very deep. There's a lot going on with each of them. Then you've got character development, which people were always clamoring for, where a character changes and grows over the course of a series, where you get to watch them evolve. Gurren Lagann, a great example. Shimon, the whole show is kind of about his development as a character. He's not particularly deep of a character at the beginning, but by the end, he has grown a depth because we've watched how he's evolved over time. Both of those are great. Both of those are pretty plot reliant. But the way I saw it, there was another kind of characterization that nobody was talking about, which is chemistry. And what's so great about the characters in Hidamari Sketch is that none of them is particularly deep, none of them has a ton of development, but they work so well together. The way that their personalities bounce off of one another just makes them a joy to watch. There's this great sense of intimacy between the four girls in the series, where their conversations all feel real and understandable. They come from a place of relatability. A lot of these moe four girls in high school comedy shows, the characters are just kind of like wacky and not interesting. Like, it's more about each one has a clear personality trait, and here's what, this one's the kooky one, this one's the straight-laced one, and if the kooky one does this, the straight-laced one's gonna hit him with the fan. It's so tired, and it doesn't feel real. It feels like it's somehow generated from the existence of other anime. When I look at a show like Yuru Yuri, which I know a lot of people like, but I've never been able to get into it, because the way I saw it, it was like these characters don't feel like humans, they feel like archetypes. They feel like they've been copy-pasted from some other show, and they're just here to make anime jokes. Whereas with Hidamari's sketch, each character feels like a person, not necessarily one with a lot going on in their lives, not necessarily one with a deep story to tell. They're just kind of average high school girls. Each one has a distinctive personality, but it's not like a caricature. Like, Yuno is kind of shy and not very sure of herself, but this is not like the dominant trait of her personality. Most of the show, she's just hanging out with her friends, having conversations, and the conversations they have are conversations that real people would have. They go and do things that real people would do, and usually it's about just the little minor funny things that happen to people in life. The characters are fun. They're people who you would want to be friends with, and you get to watch them be friends with each other. I made a comparison. I have this video called What Slice of Life Anime, Let's Plays, and Podcasts Have in Common. It's titled something like that. And I was comparing Hidamari's sketch to stuff like Game Grumps or Hello Internet or like podcasts in general. The video is kind of weirdly structured, but the point that it makes is simply that the appeal of something like the Game Grumps, of a Let's Play between a couple of friends, is that you get to vicariously experience their friendship. And when it's two interesting people or two funny people, then it's like their friendship is one that you wouldn't get to experience in your own life. Because even though you have your own friends and you have fun with your own friends and you have your own jokes and maybe your friends are great, these two people are creative comedians who their friendship is one that you would never get to experience because you don't have two friends who are talented like this. And so getting to vicariously experience their friendship gives you that experience as though you were having it for yourself, or at least that you get to be near it. And Hidamari's sketch has that kind of appeal to me, where I am not a high school girl. None of my friends are high school girls, even though these conversations and these things that are happening, these scenarios, are very realistic and seem like stuff that would just be the common lives of high school girls. I would never experience that. I will never have the chance to experience that and have never. So I can connect with these things because all of them make sense. All of the ways that these characters interact and react is stuff that I could imagine myself doing were I in that scenario. I just would never be in that scenario. So I'm vicariously experiencing the friendship of high school girls. Great fun time. And I was really into that whole genre because, again, I was obsessed with girls. But I wasn't a girl. I never talked to any girls. I didn't know any girls. So the best way for me to experience the friendship of girls, and mind again, when I say that I was obsessed with girls, I mean it in this sort of way that's not like purely sexual. I mean, there was definitely a sexual element to it, but there's a reason that I was more attracted to moe for girls shows than I was to like harem comedies. Because a harem series sees girls from a male lens. It's all about what their charm points are, what's attractive about them, how big is the girl's tits, what does she look like when she's flustered. When you look at most harem shows, you'll notice that they go out of their way to have a gradient scale of breast size. Like, you've got the flat girl, the B cup girl, the C cup girl, the D cup girl, the E cup girl. Look at something like even Strike Witches, not a harem show, but like every character has a different bust size and different height. They all have unique proportions so that each one can appeal to a different person's fetish. And that's what male-centric fan service shows are about. Male-centric shows with a bunch of girls. And mind you, I enjoy shows like Strike Witches. I enjoy shows like Saki even, but I don't think those are the same genre as something like Hidamari's sketch, which is not going out of its way to have appealing girls for a male audience. It's just about girls being girls. And that is a completely different kind of appeal to me. That's what the appeal of K-On! Is as well, is that it's about these 5 high school girls who aren't being fetishized. There's nothing sexual about the show. It's just getting to vicariously experience this particular brand of feminine friendship that I would never be able to experience as a man. And of course, because I was a teenager, I could not explain any of this nearly as well as I can now. This is a very eloquent, I've had 10 years to think about it, I looked back and put everything into perspective and now I get it kind of argument that I'm making here. As a teenager, I had no such abilities, so instead I was like, oh, fuck people who like plot, y'all are stupid. Character chemistry is the only thing that matters. I've always been an abrasive dick, if you haven't noticed, but only because the world made me this way. So yeah, for a long time, I was like the guy who was into these cute girl shows, but really it was around the time of K-On! That I actually started to get very jaded towards them, and I almost didn't like K-On! And really I think that K-On! Kind of put a capstone on this whole genre for me, and I haven't ever been able to get as into it since. Because again, in the late 2000s, being into these kind of shows was weird, and while Moe was taking off as a concept, this particular kind of show was not as big. And even, I wouldn't even say that this kind of show is necessarily Moe. Like, it's grouped in with that, but it's kind of a separate phenomenon for the reasons I went over. Like, Moe is a lot more male-oriented, whereas these cute girls doing whatever shows weren't always. And I do think they grew increasingly that way as these shows caught on with a male audience. But when I saw Manabi Straight and Hidamari Sketch, those were the only 2 shows like that season. It wasn't like there was a ton of 4-girl shows on at the time. And as the year went on, it's not like there was, we had Lucky Star, and that was the one for that season and the subsequent one. And then we would get more and more as the seasons wore on. But the season that K-On! Debuted, it was like K-On! And Hyakko were the 2, and I think there might have even been a third. I think Kanamemo might have come out that season, which was like the same kind of thing, but Yuri slanted. So all of a sudden, it had full-blown become a genre by early 2009. And at that point, that's when it started to lose its appeal for me, because each one individually was like, all right, I get a new set of 4 girls, a new perspective, 4 different personalities who I'm going to watch and enjoy their interactions. But now it's like we're getting repeats of old characters. These ones are just like pale comparisons. Like when I watched Hyakko, the main girl in that felt like off-brand Miyako from Hidamari Sketch. And I don't even know if that's fair, but that's just, the show felt like, well, this is like Hidamari Sketch, but not as good. And then that's how like all these started to look to me. So when K-On! Came out, my first impression of it was, this is just another one. Like, I didn't care about it. I wasn't a huge fan. I think I watched a few episodes of the show and just kind of drifted away. And I mean, 2009, I think that was a year I finished literally one show that aired that year. I was like almost exclusively watching older stuff. So I don't believe, I did not finish K-On! The year that it aired. I watched like maybe half of it and I just didn't care that much. So it was only when the second season started that I finally watched the whole first one, I think with my brother Shade, who was starting to get really into cute girl shows himself. And I watched the whole thing, and I remember considering it like a strong 8 to a light 9 because I thought it was so technically capable and that it checked all the boxes, but I still didn't feel that strongly about it because I really saw it as, it's like, yes, there's a lot of great things about this show. It does it perfectly fine, but I already have Hidamari's Sketch, which I'd seen 2 seasons of at that point. It was like really into it. I already have Lucky Star. Why do I need K-On! And it wasn't until season 2 where I felt like the show really proved itself and made a name for itself and solidified its place in my heart. So yeah, I kind of fell out with this genre because it got too big, because suddenly there was a million of them. And so when the genre kind of entered its heyday and started gaining popularity and more people were watching it, I remember 2010 we had like Tantei Opera Milky Holmes, and that went on for a bunch of seasons. Yuri Yuri went on for a bunch of seasons. And granted, there had been plenty of these before Hidamari Sketch. I mean, Azumanga Daioh was kind of the progenitor of this whole subgenre, and I was never that into that show. I enjoyed the manga, I just hadn't liked the voice acting in the show, so I didn't watch it. We had like Galaxy Angel that's kind of along the same lines, and a bunch of Punimoe stuff in the early 2000s that was similar, but I hadn't really been into most of that stuff. Like, I really think Hidamari Sketch represented a new direction that the genre was going to take. Like, it's not that fundamentally different from Azumanga Daioh, but it's so much more slice of life and so much less comedy focused, and Lucky Star was so similar to it that I really think that from those two onwards, and with K-On! And stuff, we really got this other branch of what the genre was going to be. And that's the kind of show that started having a lot more, Yuri Yuri's kind of tangentially the same thing, and God, there's just so many like one season shows like this. And I mean, I did a whole thing on it in early 2016, my How to Distinguish Cute Girl anime, where I was comparing 3 of those shows that were on that season, which was Sancha Sanyo and Anne Happy and Pande Peace, the latter 2 of those not being very good. And then Sancha Sanyo had like a great first couple of episodes where it really felt like the characters were a little bit deeper and had a little bit more chemistry than most of what was coming out, and then the rest of the show just kind of was like whatever. Like, it just felt like another one. That's why I ended up not liking that show as much. I know some people who loved the early episodes went on to love the rest of the show a lot more than I did. And I mean, it had plenty of great animation cuts and stuff like that, but it just felt so, man, I've seen this before. Man, all these side characters have been in every other one of these shows. And Hidamari Sketch, one of the strengths of that shows is it doesn't have like any side characters in the early part. And the ones that it does are super memorable. You've just got like the teacher who she is probably the most like generic side character-y character in the series, but she's fine. You've got the landlady who's great and I love her. You've got Sai's little sister, and that's like it. That's like, and the principal, who's just kind of like a gag character in the background. So like, yeah, there's almost no side characters. It's mostly just focused on the chemistry of the main 4 girls. They never distract you by getting all this other stuff until they finally introduce 2 new girls in season 3, which I still have never watched. And that's kind of also part of the thing about this, is that with these cute girl shows, it's kind of like when you have one, you don't need any more, which is why it's funny that there's so many of them airing all the time, because to me, anytime I start up one and it's not as good as Hidamari Sketch, it's like, why don't I just go back and watch Hidamari Sketch? Why don't I just go watch K-On! Why don't I just go watch Lucky Star? Why do I need 20 shows that are the exact same thing, but weaker? And I never even finished Hidamari Sketch, because these shows also, like, for a lot of them, any one episode is as good as watching another episode, if you get what I mean. Like, I mean, I could watch one episode of Hidamari Sketch a month and it would basically be the complete Hidamari Sketch experience. It's not a show you need to rush through. If you watch one episode, you've watched them all, kind of. I mean, granted, each one has distinct things that happen, but the way that they're enjoyed is the same. The episodes are even out of order. The whole show is anachronic and it matches up to calendar dates. One of the ways to watch the show is to watch each episode on the day that it takes place on. It's not something you have to rush through, and it took me over a year to finish the first season of Hidamari Sketch, partly because the subtitles were incredibly fucking slow to come out, but I did not finish the first season until over a year had passed since I'd started it, and the same thing was true of the second season, and I still never finished the third one. And this was also true of like every Shinbo show. Like, until what was the first one? I think Madoka I watched within 6 months. It wasn't like right when it finished, but I think that might have been the first Shaft show, or first Shinbo show that I finished within a year of its airing, or a year of me starting it, even though Shinbo was my favorite director for that entire period of time. His shows just, they can be a little difficult to watch back-to-back episodes. So why am I talking about this in here if I still care so much about Hidamari Sketch? Mostly because, again, I haven't finished the show. I've found it difficult to go back to simply because, again, in the process of watching new shows, I'm gonna end up watching a bunch of these fucking 4 girls shows. You know, if I watch Sancha Sanyo in a new season, then it makes me not want to go back and kind of do the same thing and watch Hidamari Sketch, similar to how I've never gotten around to Iyashikei shows, because if I sit through all of Flying Witch, then I'm not gonna want to also then go back and finish Aria finally. So this is really a consequence of the fact that I try to keep up with new shows on some level. I mean, I don't watch them while they're airing, but I do try to catch up. And also just finding time for Hidamari Sketch, because I know exactly what I'm going to be in for. Like, I know what mood it creates. I know that it's a show to kind of lay back and take in, and I don't exactly have an analysis video that I expect to be making about it. The most interesting point that I think I could have made was the one I made in that video about the appeal of it, which I just explained, so this is already, I've done my job, you know, there's not much more to say. And I could be wrong about that. Maybe there's more to say about the later seasons, but I have a real difficulty finding time to go back and rewatch old favorites without having an excuse. Now there is, as with all these shows, the concern that I'll go back to Hidamari Sketch and it won't be as great as I remember, or that all of these other moe shows that I've seen will have made it feel more generic, or that just knowing how great a K-On! Is, makes me feel less about it. But honestly, I don't think that'll happen with Hidamari Sketch, because even though it's been a long time since I've seen it, I remember so many distinctive elements of it. Like, the characters are so strong. They each kind of embody, when I see any character who's remotely like Yunochi, I compare them to her, and they always come out worse. She is kind of the best version of that character that I've seen. Maybe I'm biased because I saw her first, but whenever I see a character who reminds me at all of Hidamari Sketch, I always end up feeling like the Hidamari Sketch character was better. And the show also has the great Shinbo direction, where it's very visually unique, has a very interesting sense of pacing. I can remember a bunch of really memorable scenes from it, which I can't say for almost any other show in the genre besides Lucky Star and K-On! Just in general, I feel like my feelings for that show were very legitimate, and they have, if anything, been strengthened by seeing so many of these other shows that I feel like don't live up to it. So maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it won't be the, favorites list contender that it was once, but I have enough strong memories of the show that I feel more confident about revisiting it. And me talking about it here is more to discuss the history that I have with that show and with the rest of the moe anime that's come out in the last 10 years that I just don't think compares. Hidamari Sketch, Lucky Star, and K-On! Really do kind of represent the top of the genre for me, and they all came out relatively close together. Hidamari Sketch started in 2007 and went up through, I think, 2012 or 13 with the final seasons and OVAs. Lucky Star in 2007, and K-On! 2009 through 2010. I think the movie might have been 2011. So I feel like that kind of bookended a great period. I mean, Tamako Market's also really good, though it's a little different, and it didn't go on long enough to really get to the point, I thought. And then eventually we started seeing a sort of evolution where Hibike Euphonium doesn't really feel like one of those shows. It's much more of a melodrama. I really think it wears the skin of a Four Girls shows, particularly in the first season, but it sheds that skin as it goes, and it becomes apparent that it was never really that kind of show in the first place. So aside from something like Hibike Euphonium that's taking it in a really different direction, I don't feel like there's been a breakout hit in this genre recently. Possibly because it's being supplanted with stuff like these new workplace series shows where it's cute girls doing a job, where we had Shirobako, which is one of the greatest anime ever made, which is less cutesy, but it's follow-ups in the form of stuff like Soregaseiyu, New Game, and Girlish Number, which are much more adorable, but still all about work. They're not about characters just doing everyday life stuff so much as they are about doing a job and being in a creative field. I think that might be the new version of this, and I do like that genre a lot. I've enjoyed all of those shows so far, and there's obviously still more to be said because Girlish Number somehow said something completely different from Shirobako, justifying its existence, and in spite of being, a less good version of something similar from the same genre, they both are justified. So maybe we'll see this burn itself out. Girls sports shows kind of became a thing after Saki, which was a good show, and there's been a few good ones here and there, a few whatevers. They had Long Riders, which was from a season ago, and just, it's here and there. It's hit or miss, but there's been some good girls sports shows lately. I just think that the whole cute girls doing cute things thing is kind of branching out, and the stuff that's still languishing in that old school style that has already reached its peak, I think is just going to keep looking worse. And so that's why we've got more of these shows that are branching out, more of the cute girls doing military stuff like Strike Witches, which is great, Kankole, High School Fleet was good last year, so yeah, we've got this continue. I'm really wondering what's going to be the next kind of moe show. What's going to be the next type? Because we've gotten the cute girls action, we've gotten the cute girls sports, the cute girls doing cute things, the more melodramatic ones. We've got stuff that's kind of breaking off to do something way more bizarre, because I think there's sort of a new genre forming between Yurikuma Arashi, Rolling Girls, and Flip Flappers. That's a whole new subset of shows that are a crossover crossover between shoujo and moe and just a whole new world of bizarre shit. I wouldn't be surprised if we got more of those, but I'm wondering if there's a new avenue that hasn't yet been explored. If there's some new subgenre of cute girls doing cute things that will blossom in the years to come. Who knows? I don't have the answers to these questions. Anyway, that's about it for my rundown of my history with moe. On the next episode, I'm going to do a similarly broad lens-ish thing as I've been doing for the last couple episodes, but with a little bit more focus on Otaku no Video. And I'm going to talk about that OVA as well as the general otaku-oriented media, like stuff that's about being an otaku, especially focused on stuff that either came out or that I watched in the late 2000s. Obviously, Otaku no Video is older than anything I've actually talked about on Old-Ass Anime Cast so far, but I first saw it in 2007, so look forward to that, and I will see you in the next one.